Pasito tum tum, pasito tum tum, pasito tum tum, pasito tum tum, pasito tum tum.
If you're familiar with my channel, you might be wondering, why is a movie channel talking about wrestling? Well, in case you didn't notice, I'm a wrestling fan. Big, small, it don't matter. The other reason is, wrestling is like a movie.
We make movies.
If there is one similarity that movies and wrestling have in common, is they share the dilemma of good versus evil. It's the bad guys facing off against the good guys. In wrestling terms, face versus heel. The heel gets pushed as a destructive monster, while the face gets pushed as the hero to dethrone the heel, built up through weeks of storylines. But when adding the athleticism with theatrics, it becomes a mix of different forms of entertainment, from soap opera, Broadway theater, or a music concert.
Professional wrestling is show business.
So long are the days where matches happen for the sake of booking. Now, there must be a reason. And these reasons can fall into any form of movie genre, such as pure action, comedy, romance, horror, drama, and even real-life tragedies that are brought up.
Esta función se la dedicamos a un hermano, en paz descanse, Eddie Guerrero. Gracias.
Two wrestlers that don't get along are forced to team up. Will they be able to put their differences aside and prevail? A former drug addict is given the chance to be world champion. Will he be able to overcome his inner demons?
From the time we walk through the curtain to the time we walk back through the curtain, we tell a story. But we don't tell it with words, we tell it with our bodies.
Wrestling can demand too much suspense of our disbelief, but when it's done at its best, it can leave an emotional impact that resembles to a satisfying conclusion of a movie, making us want to come back to recreate that same emotional experience we invested on these characters. As far-fetched as it may sound, this is when wrestling can transcend into art. That is, if you include the wrestlers' creative athleticism to how the crowd reacts to each storyline.
Even though we call ourselves sports entertainment because of the athleticism involved, the key word in that phrase is entertainment.
The ring is like a theater stage, and the wrestlers are the actors playing characters, also known in wrestling term as kayfabe,
which is code for maintaining the illusion that the character is real.
Just like in movies, not everything about wrestling is high art. When it's bad, it is awkward, it's cringy, in the worst case scenarios, it's disgusting and mean-spirited.
Eddie ain't in heaven. Eddie's down there. In hell!
Now that it is no secret that wrestling is predetermined and carefully choreographed, one of the key reasons to why it has survived for so long is for how linked to our pop culture it is. It has been able to adapt, borrow, or just plain copy popular media characters that can transcend into the ring.
Nobody beats the bad guy.
So say goodnight to the bad guy.
Some wrestlers become so big that they get inserted into part of pop culture, starting at first in the ring and then evolving into Hollywood stardom. Sometimes it is vice versa, with celebrities joining in or actors turning into wrestling afterwards, once again showing that pop culture and wrestling are linked together, yet once in a while get mingled into social political issues of their time. If movies are a satire of our real-world issues, then wrestling is an exaggeration of the pop culture we consume. So, I want to look at how does wrestling reflect our pop culture? How is each decade socially and culturally defined through the eyeglasses of pro wrestling? Starting from when it became popular in the 80s to our current 2020s decade. This might have several WWE references since they focus a lot more on the pop culture, while other promotions like Mexican Lucha or Japanese wrestling focus a lot more on the wrestling itself. I'll still do my best to mention them once in a while. So put on your face paint, lace up those boots, and put on your tights, as I let Michael Buffer take it from here.
Let's get ready to rumble!
Wrestling goes way back to ancient times of Egypt and Greece as an Olympic sport. It evolved from the Irish using it to settle their arguments, to carnival circuses in the late 1800s, and then resurrecting as a televised sport combat. However, the early real fights were not as spectacular or intriguing, so once again, pro wrestling evolved into making the moves more innovative and athletic, as well as the wrestlers more entertaining.
Ricky gets things started off with a bang.
In the 1950s, pro wrestling had its first taste of theatrics with Gorgeous George, a flamboyant feminine wrestler that sold arenas as the bad guy, just so they could see him lose. By this time, there were already rumors about the industry being phony, through interviews in the 30s by Jack Pfeffer. In the early 80s, former wrestler Eddie Mansfield revealed the secrets of wrestling in the infamous 2020 interview.
Is this real wrestling? No. Not real, no. Not at all.
However, some still believe that pro wrestling was a legit fight. That is until Vince McMahon came into the picture after he took over the WWE from his father in 1982, back then known as the World Wrestling Federation. In order to avoid paying tax cuts for each venue, Vince McMahon exposed the business not as a sport, but as a soap opera entertainment.
Wrestling is not really wrestling. Wrestling promoters have told their secrets.
But rather than hurting the business as it should have, it escalated it into high popularity as never before. In the 80s, the world went international with the rise of computers, news media reporting became international with the debut of CNN, the Berlin Wall fell, symbolizing their yearn for wanting to be international with the West. Likewise, wrestling in the 80s broke from the territorial mindset to international, worldwide recognition, profiting the WWF and WCW. The first WrestleMania pay-per-view was an encapsulation of everything that wrestling was becoming at this point, mixing pro wrestling with actors and celebrities, establishing the foundation that wrestling can survive without pop culture.
We borrow from such program niches like soap operas, like The Days of Our Lives, or music videos such as those on MTV.
In the 80s, Ronald Reagan impacted television shows, mostly cartoons, by deregulating their advertisements, meaning that shows could sell their toys as much as they wanted. The WWF took advantage when promoting themselves as a kids show that could sell toys to the kids.
You WWF talking wrestlers aren't big enough to be talking tough! Yeah!
In doing so, the wrestlers had to embrace a more cartoony, over-the-top, cheesy characters that resembled to the popular Saturday morning cartoons like G.I. Joe, He-Man, Transformers, Ninja Turtles. They even had their own cartoon shows in the 80s.
See you at the Survivor Series, oh yeah!
The program was set up to be a more kid-friendly family event where the stories followed a simple black and white narrative of good guys versus bad guys. The wrestlers became much brighter and loud, more campy and colorful, led by the stars of the 80s like Hulk Hogan, Andre the Giant, Randy Savage, The Ultimate Warrior, and so on.
Say your prayers, eat your vitamins, be true to yourself, true to your country, be a real American.
Other promotions like Glow wouldn't back down from embracing the cartoony, over-the-top characters. WCW and other promotions focused more on the wrestling, while still profiting from the wrestling boom of the 80s. But as much as the 80s is romanticized and looked up as a fun era from outside, behind the scenes, it looked more like a Scarface. Not just for the obvious reason that everyone was doing cocaine back then. As much as wrestling barely came out to the open public, they still had a mafia-like mentality of protecting the business, their spots, staying on top, or competing against each other for real, leading up to tragedies and crimes like the murder of Bruiser Brody, the murder of Dino Bravo, Jimmy Snuka killing his girlfriend and still being promoted by the WWF, the unexpected tragedy of the Von Erich family, the accusations of Moolah exploiting her female wrestlers into prostitution.
In the dressing room before a match, Brody was knifed in the abdomen. He died hours later.
Much of the 80s was shaped by the AIDS pandemic transmitted through sexual intercourse. The administration of Ronald Reagan was slow to respond to the crisis, summarizing it as the fault of the homosexual community.
Some male homosexuals has triggered an epidemic of a rare form of cancer.
And these views would be reflected on movies. Slasher films of the 80s targeted teenagers who had sex after marriage in Friday the 13th, Halloween, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Slumber Party Massacre, and more. Action films of the 80s followed the homophobic narrative of promoting bodybuilders as the true embodiment of masculinity through Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, Jean-Claude Van Damme, similar to how promoters pushed big, muscular bodybuilders as their wrestling stars. And the only way to look like this was through the use of steroids, which everyone did back then, before it was illegal.
Vince McMahon and the World Wrestling Federation have been indicted on charges of providing steroids to WWF entertainers.
Everybody was on steroids, that's what they were marketing.
This would of course follow Vince McMahon in the 90s during the steroid trial, alongside to the sex scandal accusations that could have sent Vince into prison, and the company might have been dead at this point.
If I would be the man for that job, I didn't sleep with your vice president. 2 weeks later, I'm fired.
If there is something American wrestling in the 80s can tell us, is how slow yet eager America is to stay in touch with society, when other countries are far ahead, even concerning the wrestling business. By the time Cyclone McKee made Lucha Libre masks popular around the 30s, Mexican lucha had already become part of Mexican culture, in the days of El Santo and Blue Demon, starting in B horror films that reflected the anxiety of Mexico at that time. Japanese wrestling became big in the 50s by Ricky Dosen, who beat up American wrestlers after their shameful World War II loss, launching other Japanese wrestlers into their pop culture of anime and manga. The 80s was the first decade in American wrestling to narrow down their social environment. It was a decade that knew how to hide their dark paths by distracting us with consumerism through colorful, over-the-top hokiness. America in the 90s followed a counterculture shift from the cartoony, colorful cheesiness of the 80s into a much edgy, gritty dark approach, turning away from their kid-friendly program into a more adult-oriented show. Wrestlers from the 80s evolved from their colorful personas into more rebellious, dark sides of themselves. The 90s belonged to the Generation X, often regarded as cynical, rebellious, slackers, desensitized, and hormonally charged.
You know what? I'm tired of Generation X getting a bad rap.
Generation X was born surrounded by revolutions in the 70s and the dissolution of their leaders during the Watergate scandal and the Vietnam War. This would establish their lack of trust over authorities and rebellious attitude towards the establishment.
I do whatever the hell I want, when I want to.
It would be reinforced through movies and music from the 90s like Nirvana's rebellious tone. Movies like Pulp Fiction, Fight Club, Natural Born Killer, The Matrix, American Beauty, American History X were anti-establishment films that favor a free lifestyle from the ordinary, while antagonizing any authority figure.
Do you believe in fate, Neil?
No.
Why not?
Because I don't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life.
In pro wrestling, it reflected the same rebellious attitude shown on television inside the ring.
We also think that you're tired of the same old simplistic theory of good guys versus bad guys.
This is where it blurred the lines of good and evil, showcasing the good guys as anti-heroes rebelling against the establishment run by tyrannical leaders like Vince McMahon in the WWF and Eric Bischoff in WCW.
None of you are as big as Vince McMahon.
Wrestlers like Stone Cold Steve Austin, NWO, DX, Brian Pillman, Sting, The Rock were figures that made it cool to break the rules and go against the authority that wrote the rules but wouldn't follow them.
You think just because you have a contract, you can break the rules of professional wrestling? Is that yes?
Bill Clinton wouldn't help the case that even leaders can get immoral.
I did not sleep with that young intern.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
I was up all night.
Often playing to the fantasy of wanting to punch your boss in the face, especially cemented by the popularity of Steve Austin.
The bottom line is, you can kiss my ass.
Teams like DX were named after Generation X, playing off to the speculation that their generation was perverted, vulgar, and degenerates.
We are the Generation X. You make the rules, and we will break them.
In the rise of the punk guts, movies in the 90s played the narrative of the relatable anti-hero with Blade, The Crow, Pulp Fiction, The Matrix, reflected by the emotional stress that Generation X was going through. Younger generations were catered around as the future of the world, while Generation X was hurt by policies that left them with high debts and mediocre jobs, regarding them as the forgotten generation.
we're going to put the U.S. title on you, and then we're going to take you here, so then you get this world title shot. Well, all that never happened.
Since they grew up in the 80s era of drugs and television, those were the only things that unburdened their frustrations and anger. But even television got more angry and grungy in the 90s. Cartoon shows pushed the envelope to what was acceptable for kids to just being pure adult content like The Simpsons, South Park, King of the Hill, Beavis and Butthead. As for films, they got more violent, desensitizing the audience from censorship and selling the narrative that if it bleeds, it sells.
That's when I realized my one true calling in life. I'm a natural-born killer.
In the same way, wrestling was influenced by the desensitization of television, choosing a more violent product that resembled the greedy violence of Quentin Tarantino's films, American History X, Natural Born Killer, or Seven.
Murder, crime, poverty, these things don't concern me. What concerns me are celebrity magazines, television with 500 channels.
Japanese promotions like FMW grew attraction based on how violent and gory their matches were through the concept of the dead match. The ring would be surrounded with barbed wires which either exploded, electrocuted, or the ring was set on fire, causing the wrestlers extreme pain and severe injuries. This hardcore style of matches would then travel to inspire other American promotions. ECW was one of the earliest American promotions to cater to a more adult audience by showcasing extreme violence, blood, and sex. The shows were too graphic that were believed at first to be real fights. And can you blame them when most of their matches involved weapons, barbed wires, tables, and fire? WCW wasn't too far from getting crazy with their gimmicks. The WWF had the most drastic change during what is called the Attitude Era. This was a time when the WWF no longer focused on the kid-friendly technicalities of wrestling, but more of a brawling style that made it resemble more to a Jerry Springer sketch. The matches had street fighting stipulations, using weapons like ladders, trash cans, regular tables, putting them through the announcer tables, using the unsafety of sure shots to the head, back when they didn't know the repercussions of head injuries. Mexican lucha would still focus on the wrestling, but being that the US and Mexico are neighbors, it would influence some of that American edgy street fighting for lucha later on. Just like the 90s pop culture experimented on what they could get away with, so did wrestling push the envelope to how far they could cross the line to what was acceptable on television, in relation to the violence, vulgarity, and nudity. In the case of female wrestling in America, Generation X grew up during the 70s sexual awakening, getting conditioned to buy products through sex being the selling point. I could argue the 90s were some of the most sexualized decade for women on television, with Baywatch, True Lies, From Dusk Till Dawn, Striptease, Showgirls.
You've even seen Jamie Lee Curtis do a striptease dance at True Lies in front of him.
In the same way, it influenced how we perceived female wrestling in the 90s, not appreciating them for their ring talent, but for their bodies.
Vince was just taking what a lady she was in the meeting, and she's beautiful, and then he and Russo would sit and go back and forth and imagine in white panties.
Most of their segments involved getting them naked through pudding matches, cat fights, evening gun matches, bra and panty matches, or being in the cover of Playboy magazine.
Many on hand just had to get a glimpse at Deborah's puppies.
Being that this is a male-majority sport with a male-majority audience, the people did not want to see female wrestling. The promoters did not care to have female wrestling. They tried to make it more serious the next decade, and some other promotions being more successful. But we all know what the fans still wanted. The 90s is often regarded as the most popular decade in wrestling, more than the 80s. I mean, it was so cool to talk about it back then. You could talk about it with your jock friends in high school and college. On the other hand, it wasn't without its controversy. Wrestling in the 90s reflected the desensitization of television and the glorification of violence, which came at a price that brought into our reality the Columbine school shooting, the Owen Hart stunt gone wrong that killed him in the ring, on live pay-per-view.
Wasn't it cool to hear that Owen Hart died? I'm like, are you serious? They changed wrestling so much that wrestling fans have become so desensitized.
This is where wrestling became entertainment for the lowest common denominator, inspired by television's exploitation, including shock value, for the sake of shock value like Jerry Springer, reality TV shows, or the O.J. Simpson trial. It could be argued whether the 90s were as rebellious as we like to think. I mean, they weren't that many revolutions compared to the 70s. Then again, the Y2K prophecy was meant to shut down all computers and end the world in the new millennium. So I guess that gave many the excuse to do whatever they wanted.
No one is going to remember Y2K. They're going to be talking about is Y2J.
But as we all know, in the next millennium, the end of the world would come out in a different way. The 2000s is known by a few events. The double murder-suicide of Chris Benoit shook the wrestling industry, forcing it to take drug testing more seriously, as it brought awareness to the severity of head injuries, just like it did to other sporting events that same decade.
Former champion Chris Benoit found dead in his Atlanta home along with his wife and young son.
The rise of social media brought new ways of entertainment that would have been lost into obscurity if it wasn't for the internet. Similar to how it brought from obscurity other indie and international promotions to the public like Ring of Honor, AAA, CCW, NOAH, or New Japan Pro Wrestling, and so on. Not only did it create new ways of social interaction through Facebook, Twitter, and long-dead MySpace,
what the hell is a MySpace?
But it gave us easy access to information, including wrestling itself, for the better and for the worse.
A lot of our guys, unfortunately, listen to people on the internet, the so-called experts who've never laced up a pair of boots.
Good or bad?
However, the 2000s is often regarded by the terrorist attacks of 9/11, causing the lives of nearly 3,000 people. This shook the core of America from turning their traumatic experience into an act of vengeance.
I felt like I too wanted to fight back in some way.
The decade was marked as a time of pro-patriotism, pro-military, pro-war, and anti-terrorism.
We don't negotiate with terrorists.
While some tried to ignore the event through the rising popularity of fantasy which distracted them from their reality, like Lord of the Rings, Pirates of the Caribbean, or Harry Potter, some tried to make sense of the event as it acknowledged their pain, their anger, the anxiety of the war, and how America changed during Bush's administration with security and surveillance.
On the names of innocent thousands murdered, I pray you spend the rest of eternity with your 72 cores roasting in a jet fuel fire in hell.
Movies like Steven Spielberg's War of the Worlds was an allegory of 9/11 that reflected the devastation of an alien attack and how it gripped the people's minds with vengeance.
And we get back at them! We get back at them!
The Dark Knight was a post-9/11 depiction of the enforcement of personal and private surveillance after getting terrorist attacks.
Spying on 30 million people isn't part of my job description.
For the rest of pop culture, it was marked as a time of national pride that was considered treasonous to speak wrong against their country.
But it's our home, our team, and if you don't want to root for your team, then you should get the hell out of the stadium.
Bill Maher got fired from his own show after making unfavorable remarks to the American Army.
We have been the cowards, lobbing cruise missiles from 2,000 miles away, staying in the airplane when it hits the building. Say what you want about it, not coward.
In wrestling, this didn't concern any international shows. While other American promotions like TNA and Ring of Honor kept themselves away from political issues, WWE seemed to hit it real hard on politics.
We didn't start this thing. Terrorism started this when they hijacked planes, flew into buildings on 9/11.
2 days after the attack, WWE went on air to pay tribute to the victims of 9/11. In a moment that felt insecure to go to public events.
We would like to extend our condolences to the victims of the terrorist acts that occurred on Tuesday in New York City and Washington, D.C.
Nevertheless, it marked them as one of the first events to open up after the terrorist attack. As the decade evolved, the WWE became more patriotic, from giving honor to the American flag for a cheap pop, to paying tribute to the American troops in Afghanistan in every Christmas special, something they still do to this day. At this point, it was no longer suitable to go up against the system, when the system was crumbling down from inside and out. This is when violence was no longer the focal point of wrestling, but went back to the conservative PG style of wrestling. Still, they could get pretty violent once in a while. The image of the anti-hero was no longer suitable, and it brought back the old black and white values of good and evil established by the narrative of George Bush.
Either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists.
In this case, John Cena was the capitalist to represent the image of the moral values of American wrestling, as he was promoted as a Marine sympathizer, saluting as a Marine, even being in a Marine movie.
We have caught and compromised to a permanent end Osama bin Laden.
Even though WWE tried to show support to their country, it had a flip side to antagonize any outsider as a threat or just simply bad. If there is one downside about patriotism, is that it creates self-superiority over your group while dehumanizing the rest as inferior or just evil.
You started this very program with Lillian Garcia singing God Save the Queen. You're in the United States of America, son.
In the awakening of terrorism, America became more xenophobic, more afraid of un-Native Americans, targeting Muslims into racist stereotypes as terrorists. Mockumentaries like Borat exposed the American xenophobia they had towards foreigners by going along with the buffooneries of another xenophobic Middle Eastern clown.
The Muslims, they look like you. Shave that dadgum mustache off so you're not so conspicuous, so you look like maybe an Italian.
In the same way, WWE followed the xenophobic mindset by either burying wrestling stars from other companies that went to the WWE.
Somebody like you doesn't get to be a world champion.
Or placed them into racist stereotypes. Now in wrestling, it is nothing new to have evil foreigners. But looking at the moment, whether if it was intentional or not, it was coincidental the increase of stereotypes who were not fully pushed to their potential or played off as villains for the simple motive that they were not Americans, sending the message that if you don't look like us, you're not one of us. They had exceptions in pushing Hispanic wrestlers like Eddie Guerrero and Rey Mysterio, but when one's mojo was lying, cheating, and stealing, and the other's world title was mediocre at best, it's clear they didn't understand the Hispanic community.
They take advantage of our healthcare system, our welfare system, and they send all their money back to Mexico and look to people like me to have to support people like them.
And no one would encapsulate more the xenophobia in the ring than this guy.
I grew up right here in America. But since 9/11, you people tend to generalize or stereotype people like me.
On December 2004, Italian Mark Julian Capone debuted on Raw as Muhammad Hassan, an Arab American who felt discriminated by Americans after 9/11. Despite portraying him as a heel by interrupting other wrestlers, attacking them, and trash-talking Americans for their racism, over the years, Muhammad Hassan has become one of the most sympathetic villains in wrestling. His motives made sense, and it came from a real place of prejudice, something that Muslims went through on American soil in a day-to-day basis. In fact, he and his colleague went to airports dressed in character and would get discriminated as terrorists every time, with one lady in the airplane calling her family that she loved them, thinking she was going to die.
Being exposed to that as a non-Arab, it was not hard to get into character and feel anger towards Americans.
This is when the character became more real to him, realizing how Americans mistreated people over an event that was out of their control. Back when it was preposterous to think America could ever be the bad guys in this scenario.
Every single one of you is prejudiced.
Now we look back at the Iraq War as a big mistake, but back then, the anger and hate made it seem like it was the right choice, since the people went back into the simple black and white view of the world. In this case, the Americans were the good guys and the Arabs were the bad people.
America, at its core,
is a racist nation.
Muhammad became one of the biggest heels in the company, that they had plans of putting the world title on him by the summer of 2005. But that all changed when art imitated reality. In an episode of SmackDown on July 7th, 2005, Hassan played a terrorist angle against The Undertaker, coincidentally being the same day that London faced an actual terrorist attack. The angle was so controversial and looked in a bad taste that WWE was threatened to lose sponsors unless they killed off the Muhammad Hassan character. And so it would be. Out of all the events, the most Americanized themed pay-per-view, the Great American Bash, Muhammad Hassan would go against The Undertaker in his final match where he lost and was sent into his last ride on his way home, never to see him on television again. Despite the 2000s being a mixed bag for wrestling fans who wanted to go back to the edginess of the 90s, I personally have a soft spot for this decade. After all, this was the time when I started to watch wrestling. The first match I ever saw was Rob Van Dam vs. The Big Show for the ECW title in 2006. Ever since, I got glued on to the storylines and the larger-than-life personas, disregarding how bad 2006 and 2007 were story-like-wise. On the other hand, this is the most political decade wrestling had ever gotten, although it was a much safe narrative of Go America and dead to terrorism, which no one can argue with. At least when wrestling got political, they wouldn't get death threats, unlike in the 90s when Sergeant Slaughter played the Iraqi sympathizer during the Gulf War, or when the WCW wrestlers were at risk just by being in North Korea in order to save Anthony Inoki's political career. This is an example of how you can't separate entertainment from politics. The idea is for entertainment to make us forget about world issues. While it is true, the fact of the matter is that without current events, they wouldn't inspire our pop culture entertainment. It is the sad saying that art comes out of devastation, and nowhere would be much more clear than the next decade. Funny how wrestling was way ahead targeting issues in the early 2010s like Russian sympathizers, illegal immigrants, empowering female wrestlers, or protesting against our authorities, when the US leader brought to our attention Russian collision, illegal immigration, women empowerment, and protesting against our authorities. You see now how wrestling, movies, and politics are linked together? You have a celebrity getting into the WWE Hall of Fame, becoming the President of the United States.
It has the highest ratings, the highest pay-per-view in the history.
Wrestling in the 2010s was the most Hollywood influenced, and Hollywood was the most politically influenced that decade. In the following years, Donald Trump brought controversy to the White House by dividing the country, getting sexual allegations, Bolton, the racist part of America, against diverse groups, immigrants, LGBTQ, and African Americans. Hollywood opposed it by promoting female empowerment, racial, ethnic, and sexual equality, and an anti-white narrative.
White lives matter! White lives matter!
Soon, the once proud patriotism of the 2000s became a toxic label of superiority over others. Social media had evolved in connecting us to the whole world that it no longer felt suitable to place patriotism above others for the generic reason that they're not Americans. That's when patriotism toned down to embrace more ethnic groups from different nationalities, giving them opportunities they wouldn't have had before.
No matter where you come from, no matter what you look like, if you believe, you can make it happen.
As culture began to empower women through the rise of the Me Too movement, which defended sexually assaulted women, Hollywood catered around to the female audience through Wonder Woman, Captain Marvel, Battle of Sexes, Ghostbusters, Little Women, anything that is owned by Disney, even to the point of gender swapping roles that were once recognized by males only. Kinda like how they pay tribute to their veteran wrestlers by cosplaying them as their female counterparts.
I think that it's time that a diva represents every single girl in the audience watching.
Women in wrestling were starting to get pushed before the Me Too. They were no longer emphasized for their bodies, but by their talents, getting them to have 5-star classic matches, likewise getting them involved in matches that only men were placed in, like in street fights, ladder matches, steel cage matches, getting their own Royal Rumble, having their own women's pay-per-view, main eventing shows and pay-per-views, even closing up WrestleMania as the main event for the first time. to a point they became more popular than the men.
What you weren't expecting was the man.
In the indies, promotions like WOW had their all-female wrestlers. Lucha Underground and Impact Wrestling went as far from not only having their female stars going up against men, but pushing them to win the men's world title. Sometimes it could get preachy, but when they let the ladies go out, it was genuinely badass. It's a big contrast to how we went from these chants to these chants. Now it's ironic how concerning the 90s were for being too desensitized, when in the 2010s it was concerning how sensitive everyone was. With the rising tension towards racism, sexism, and discrimination, cancel culture expanded on defending the oppressed by threatening the livelihood of anyone who said something unpolitically correct.
Why don't you guys send me a tweet and express your displeasure? How about that, huh?
Wrestling fans also fell into this cancel culture when going against what they were told to like as a protest to who they wanted to see get pushed.
A game-changing moment in time.
For a time they used to hijack shows and disrespect the wrestlers, which was very unfair to embarrass them when they were just doing their job. The protests were early on bolstered by wrestlers who spoke up against the mistreatment of other wrestlers, going back to the cynical anti-authority of the 90s like CM Punk or Daniel Bryan. And when Punk left wrestling for almost 7 years, his name became a bigger symbol for protests against WWE.
That Daniel Bryan show up at Raw next week and do the right thing.
In fact, AEW itself is a protest against WWE's misuse of wrestlers. Now, when wrestling wasn't being anti-WWE, it was having fun, not taking itself too seriously, while staying in touch with live streaming shows. The rise of popular television shows brought a unique concept to Lucha Underground, treating it like a seasonal television show with a very cinematic look. The inclusion of Mexican luchadors not only fed the inclusivity narrative of that time, but it also made it seem very superhero-like with the mask and the colorful characters. Likewise, in the rise of the superhero genre in movies with Marvel and DC, the fan base and the wrestling style changed. The product catered around more to the geeky fan base of pop movies, comic books, and video game nerds.
I know I'm the girl that, didn't go to prom. I'm the girl that stays home and plays video games.
The wrestlers became part of this geeky culture by referencing characters from movies, comic books, and video games.
This is a reference to Street Fighter, one of the greatest fighting games out.
The wrestling style became less technical and more choreographed, using innovative moves like dives off the ring or high risky moves and multiple super kicks in the face, resembling more to a superhero fight scene from a movie.
For Joe, bad news. Punch again.
In the awakening of the 80s nostalgia, along with the countless sequels and remakes from the 80s, wrestling fell into this nostalgic bubble by bringing wrestlers from the past or making their shows to be all about the past. Then again, nostalgia in wrestling is nothing new since they've done it for so long. I'm just glad this decade is over because I did not like these 10 years. The decade was marked by America no longer being the #1 power country in the world, just like WWE was no longer viewed as the #1 wrestling promotion. Whether it was because both authorities angered their people, or for how wrestling started to lose popularity in America. Luckily, through social media and the times of inclusivity, brought some esteem to other promotions that were viewed as far superior than the WWE, like New Japan Pro Wrestling, AEW, or WWE's own developmental show, NXT. If there is something the woke movement has taught us, is how you can have a double standard and still have a good public image. Just like Hollywood and WWE try to appear woke, they're both dictated by authoritarian governments that violate human rights, like China with Hollywood and Saudi Arabia with WWE, influencing the push of other stars, affecting storylines, and who gets banned from their country.
The WWE is going full steam ahead with Crown Jewel in partnership with a country that just murdered and dismembered a journalist for the Washington Post.
Now, in no way is WWE's inclusivity a response against Donald Trump, since they're very Republican and good old buddies with former president. It just shows how pop culture is a cycle, first promoting a message and then opposing it.
Why do I not get that exact privilege, Kurt? Is it because I'm just a woman?
Who knows how long will this inclusivity last until we go back to our tribalism? If there was only one thing that could bring us back into the Stone Age. It's funny how we just barely started 2020 and we're already feeling the effects of it. With the global pandemic killing 6 million people, quarantine was set in place to reduce the spread of the virus.
Need to stand together. And for many of us, that will mean standing at a distance.
Any social and public events were restricted, from stadiums, restaurants, theaters, concerts, to any sporting events. Movies were delayed and postponed for a whole year until it was safe to go back to the public. With how bad the economy was, workers from the whole world lost their jobs. This as well affected wrestling itself. Workers in the ring and behind the scenes got fired from big promotions, indie shows were cancelled, Ring of Honor went into a hiatus until they got owned by AEW, and for those who had to support their family, they had no choice but to keep working in front of an empty arena, at their own risk of getting sick. Even both world champions from WWE wouldn't escape from getting the virus.
As I'm sure you've heard already, I tested positive for COVID-19.
I'll admit, this is where I tuned out from watching wrestling for a time. These shows are a group collaboration between wrestlers and the fans. The fans' reaction is what makes the shows entertaining. They're not just the viewers, they're part of the show. Not only does the crowd influence the wrestlers' interaction with the fans, but it feeds them adrenaline to get through the show, helping the match turn out to be even better. Without the crowd, the shows became very boring. And what was so awkward was how they kept doing their shticks without any response.
If you want to know what 316 Day is all about, give me a hell yeah.
I always wondered, was it really necessary for the wrestlers to keep performing? How can they do their job properly in a time that required social distance, the use of masks, and no physical contact in a sport that it is all about physical contact?
Easy. Social distancing, buddy. Social distancing. I love you, but don't touch.
Wouldn't it have been better if they stayed at home safely? It was argued that the show staying on was to help us forget about the world's problems. But it was hard to forget when there was no fans due to the virus, reminding us again of the current state of the world.
And if you can't forget about the world around you and let WWE do what we do.
But hey, Mexican lucha was the safest form of wrestling. At least they had their mask on. That's when wrestling had to learn how to be creative with what little they had, just like the world improvised to do the most out of their jobs and spare time. Whether if it was virtually connecting the fans through Thunderdome, just like other sporting events connected their fans virtually, or introducing us these cinematic matches. Whether if it was in a graveyard, a football field, on top of a building, or sketches that led to a match like an Impact, these were actually fun segments that showcased how wrestling could get creative when the times were needed. Even AAA got creative having drive-thru shows. Hell, I got creative with my Instagram stories. Critics may have regarded these matches as not real wrestling that made a mockery of the industry, but I much rather have these unrealistic, goofy fights that were entertaining at least, than well-performed matches with the overdone silence of an empty arena. Now, cinematic matches were nothing new before the pandemic, and they wouldn't last long until the spread of the virus diminished on mid-2021.
And as we emerge from this dreadful pandemic, on behalf of our entire WWE family, we would simply like to say thank you.
It's still very early to predict what will the decade look like. The world has been watching the latest invasion and rumors of other places being invaded. The pandemic can also be included as an invader to our lives. This could be a decade on fighting invaders. Maybe wrestling might display more invading angles with the Forbidden Door being open, It's a term that refers to wrestlers appearing in another wrestling promotion, while still signed in with another promotion.
New Japan Pro Wrestling has walked through the Forbidden Door!
The Forbidden Door can also be a similar take on the multi-universe crossovers that we're seeing in recent movies. Again, the Forbidden Door has happened since the 90s with WWF working with New Japan, with ECW, or when they united with AAA for a spare time. You know, maybe wrestling predicts the future. Maybe there's a conspiracy here. Vince McMahon is from the future. But until the 10 years have passed, this portion of the video could be outdated. Who knows how wrestling will change in the long run, or how it will display social changes. It has already changed by embracing full-on heels like Roman Reigns as the face of the company, a far cry from what wrestling is used to having a babyface hero as their representation.
I own it all, I run it all, I feed everyone you tell them.
Big events like WrestleMania are now divided in 2 days, and with former stars leaving WWE or getting fired, this could launch a new wrestling competition between WWE and AEW. But until then, let's see what's in store in the next 10 years. So, what is the purpose of all of this? What was the point of remembering some of the darkest moments in our lifetime? Because if you see pro wrestling as an art form, then that's what art is. Art is a recollection of our world history. Art is influenced by some of the darkest moments in our lifetime. To some extent, paintings, music, and movies speak on the most challenging experiences that people go through. And it's very ironic we find escapism out of pop culture entertainment when we don't realize they make us confront the things we're trying to escape. The only difference is that it softens the issue. It makes light out of it, where it becomes safe to confront it. That's what pro wrestling can be if it's done at its very best. It can be an emotional roller coaster, it can be an escapism, and once it grabs us emotionally, we go back to it to repeat that same experience, just like when we first found a good show or a movie that grabbed us emotionally.
Así pues, la lucha libre, amigos, es una ciencia y también es un arte.
It's a mix of sports, show business, and chairs in the face. By no means was this an attempt to antagonize WWE as it's now popular to do so. This was an attempt to find something smart or something that can speak to all of us from something that is considered as silly. Because even something as marginalized or looked down upon as pro wrestling, from all the abuse and beating they take, can say something about our human condition. No matter if it's high or low art, regardless, that is something to be acknowledged and appreciated when you see the effort the guys put on.
If we can get you thinking critically or importantly about something maybe ultimately trivial as an art form like pro wrestling, maybe we can get you thinking differently about everything in life.
Now with competition on the horizon, there's no better time to be a wrestling fan than today. Who knows how long will that last? But for now, it is so good to be a fan. If you're a wrestling fan, what are some of your favorite matches? And what are some of your favorite wrestlers? Leave it in the comment section down below. And until then, see you next time.
Pasito tum tum, pasito tum tum, pasito